How's it going? So, if you're new here, let me explain to you. It's a good example of how things kind of work around here. I'm gonna stand this week. I'm gonna preach standing up, and this is the part. This is the example of how things run at Shiloh Ranch. In case you're wondering, the reason is because we forgot to put a chair up here. That's the reason. So, that's my inspiration today. So, confession, I spent like the green room before church. Usually that's where we kind of get to visit and decompress, and I wasn't talking to anybody. I literally spent the last like 5 minutes before church started. I can't decide how to finish this sermon. And so I feel like the kid who's about to turn in homework that's not quite finished. So because I got frustrated, I found this joke. There's a teacher tells this kid and says, on Monday, you said your homework blew away. And then you come back Tuesday, and you said that your father left in his truck, and he drove it to work. And then Wednesday, you said that your sister stole it. Thursday, you said that something happened, and someone took it, and I asked you to bring your parents in. And now your parents aren't here. Where are your parents? And the kid said, my dog ate them. So that is my sermon this morning. And it's not that I didn't have like a real clear idea of what I want to communicate. The problem is I don't know if it's going to make sense. And if I don't know if it's going to make sense, and it's summer, and like, here's how it works when the weather's nice. First of all, we get it. It's rare. You're going to go home. You've got 1,000 things you got to do. How many of you guys, since church has started today, have thought of at least 2 things that you need to get to when church is over? I realize the challenge I'm up against, okay? So then if you go too heady, like in the winter, it's great. You can preach about whatever you want. People go home and they gain 5 pounds throughout the week as they think about it. And they're like, this is awesome. Summer, it's just, I get it. I try to play fair and not go, so if this doesn't make sense, just don't say I didn't warn you. Colossians chapter 2, verse 20. Now, this part it's kind of heady. We're gonna go back into it. So I'm gonna read it, and then when I've read it, we'll go back and we'll kind of dissect what's in there. Verse 20, it says, since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These are rules which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use and are based on merely human commands and teachings. Good and lost yet? Okay, I'll keep going. Verse 23, such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Like I said, we'll do the best we can. Okay. Have you guys ever tried to explain something amazing to someone or really, really funny, something that happened, and you can tell that if you weren't there, you're just not going to be able to quite explain it in a way that makes sense? There's nothing worse than being the one laughing the hardest at the story that you're trying to tell. Or trying to explain. So I would imagine this is how people feel when they, like come across a grizzly bear in the wild, and then they try to tell their friends, they're like, you guys don't understand, they're huge. And everyone's like, we've heard that our whole lives. Like, that's not a surprise. They're like, no, I've heard it my whole life too, but you guys, like the words just, you can't, there's times you feel like you can't quite explain it in a way that does it any justice. There was a video this week of a lady that the title was, My Wife Fell Off a Cliff. And so everybody's like, what? And so you watch the video, and like she did fall, and like she's okay, but it was like this like 8-foot little like. And so the internet, it's a mean meme place, and so the joke was like, yeah, you didn't fall off a cliff, you like tumbled down the edge of it, Sometimes the experience and the perception, there's this relationship between the two, and so you're like, we're talking about cliffs and grizzly bears. Just give me a minute, goodness sakes! I told you it was going to be like this. I think we've got a ring in the sound also. Just I don't know if you guys can you guys hear it? See, we've all got jokes. I'm not even sorry. This is just kind of how it goes sometimes. Do you guys know that when we started the church, all we had was backfeed? That was it. You know why? I was the one setting up the sound. I set the sound up at this church for like a while. I was the one like, ah. And like if it didn't make a sound when I plugged it in, I'm like, good to go. That was Rimrock days. Sorry for everybody who has hearing problems now because of it. So the description can shape a perception. Like I can describe something to you in a way that sort of shapes your perception. But here's the thing. If I tell you about this fuzzy, sweet, cute little grizzly bear that I happen to encounter, I may change your perception and you may go like, oh, I didn't even know that was true about bears. That sounds really interesting. My words don't change the truth about the bears. Still with me. If you go out there with the wrong perception, your perception does not change how a bear has to treat you. This is why I didn't talk to anybody in the green room. I feel like that's where we're at. I feel like that's where we're at a little bit in this concept of religion and Jesus and this role that he wants to play in this interaction that he has a desire. Like my frustration in my own life is that I can only control perception. All I can do is I can stand up here. I can tell you about Jesus. I can tell you who he is. I can tell you what he says about himself. But the truth is, if this doesn't become a personal experience, we are lacking in the truth of who Jesus is in your life. Jesus is saying, I have a desire to be personal and relational. Have you ever been to church and someone says something that is so specific to something that you've been dealing with? You're like, there's no way that's a coincidence. Those little connection moments where Jesus is like, you hear it here, but this is what we do here. This is strictly perception. This is like me telling you about the wild, but my encouragement is you've got to get out there and you've got to live it. Because otherwise we start to collect perception, but we never move. We never go. We never get out there and experience who Jesus is. And instead, Jesus becomes a religion. A system of steps and things that we do to try to get what we want. So Paul, I love Paul. Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. He used to persecute the church, for you guys that don't know. He was a persecutor of the church. And then he has what with Jesus? He has an experience with Jesus. See, he had a perception about Jesus, but then he had an experience with Jesus. And when he had an experience with Jesus, his life changed. And I will promise you, if you will have an experience with Jesus, your life will change. I didn't say if you have an experience with your church. I didn't say if you have an experience where your pastor has this really meaningful sermon or someone sings a really amazing song. Like I'm telling you, we are so much less important than we get credit for. We don't matter. Like the best we can do is just sort of point. Paul has an experience, a personal experience with Jesus, and his life was changed. And the course of his history and a lot of our history was changed because of his experience. Here's what I like about him. He was probably not the most liked person. What we understand about Paul is he was probably really, really direct. He was the guy that would say it, and people would be like, we were all thinking of Paul, but we weren't going to say it. You don't just come out with the truth. Like, I mean, he was probably offensive. He was prideful. He was a lot of things, but here's what Paul did have. He had an offensive personality, but he understood human nature. He understood how we operate. He understood how we think. And as he is writing these letters, he is speaking to things that we don't even like to admit about ourselves. So what we read in Colossians, we're going to go back. What he's saying in Colossians is this. Stop holding yourself to such strict, listen, if this doesn't sound like what we've been taught religion is. Stop holding yourself to such strict standards and then thinking that those strict standards are how you are defeating sin. How many times have we done that? We hold ourselves to a strict standard. I've decided I'm going to quit being less negative. And then I realize how negative I've been because every 3 seconds I'm like, and another thing. But let me just say this. We didn't go to movie theaters when I was a kid. I don't know if you knew that, but that's like a direct one-way ticket to hell. We didn't go to dances. Hey, we're having a school dance. And I remember we were supposed to be like, I will not be there. As though people are going to be like, oh. They're like, all right, 6th graders, they don't care. All right. What did we do? We didn't do anything else. We just were at home, like Jesus wanted. I know. That's me being less negative. But do you guys ever have moments where you're like, how did this guy get this job? I know what it's like to hold yourself to a strict standard. And human nature does this. The minute everyone's telling you like, oh, that dance was so fun, and you weren't there because you're religious, you're like, well, I hope it was worth going to hell for. You have to feel superior. It's how you justify your misery. So Paul is saying, why are we still doing this? We go, don't handle this. Do not taste that. Do not touch that. What he's saying is you are still scratching the itch of self-indulgence. You are still in your self-indulgence, but you're just doing it in a different way. See, when somebody's out just completely chasing their own sin, just completely given over to the things that they think maybe they should or shouldn't do, and they're just completely lost, what the world would deem by their own standards, sinners, they are acting in self-indulgence. But so are the religious people who feel superior for not doing those things. And Paul is saying, listen, you got to be careful because there are little traps hidden all throughout. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom. Oh my gosh. If there's one thing I could change about the church, generally, if there's one thing, here's what I would like to see improve. How's that? See, that's not negative. Have you ever noticed that when people start talking about church things, they take on this, sort of attitude, like, oh, got to be very serious. The minute someone does a church video, it's one of two things. It's either like way over bubbly because that's what's popular right now. Like, hey, guys, me. Or it's like, listen, brother. You guys are cursed with a third-generation ministry kid here, but self-imposed, it's the appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship. See, worship cannot be self-imposed if it's genuine. Worship is not this self-imposed. We don't come in, you sing the song, you clap your hands. I'm standing up. I could go stomp on the drum. The cameras, I didn't give them. Hi to everybody who's joining us online. You're probably not going to get to watch this one. Worship is supposed to be this response. When you have an experience with Jesus and Jesus goes, yeah, that's who I am and this is what we do. Worship is you're like, well, then what? I got to know more. Self-imposed worship. Their false humility. He's describing the worst parts of religion. False humility. Have you ever known somebody who's falsely humble? Like, they don't mean it, but they're like, oh, maybe you're right. Yeah, we'll think about that. And you're like, no one believes you. And they're harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. Is this starting to make more sense? Like, we read through it, and it's easy to go, what is that? But now are you starting to see what Paul's trying to teach us? Like, hey, why, if you are dead to your old self, if you're dead to the old sin nature, why is your religion still trying to scratch the itch of your old sin nature? If what you're doing in church, if what you're trying to learn, listen, if what you're trying to learn about Jesus is so that you can put little spiritual bullets in your gun so you can be more prepared for an argument, that is not the concept. Jesus said it this way. Jesus, the focus of what we do here, God made man so that we could understand him, so that he's 100% God, 100% man. This is Jesus, and everything that Jesus says, here's the crazy difference between Jesus and everyone else. Everyone else wrote what they were told. Jesus, as he spoke, it became truth. When you read what Jesus said, it is not the same as what anybody else wrote. Do you understand me? When Jesus spoke it, it becomes. He could say the ground is shaking, and guess what would happen next? He's not speaking what he sees. He is creating with his words. Do you see the difference? In Matthew chapter 6, it says, when you're giving, basically I'm paraphrasing, when you give, just hush about it. When you're praying, pray like this. The Lord's Prayer. Anybody ever heard the Lord's Prayer? Like this, we know a lot about Matthew chapter 6. We know a lot about Matthew chapter 6. But then it also says this, and my guess is we haven't heard this as recently. Verse 16. This is Jesus. I love this because it gives you a direct concept into the heart of God, doesn't it? Like what we're about to read was spoke by Jesus directly from the heart of the Creator. This is what he says. When you fast, does anybody know what fasting is? It's just like when we just battle against your flesh. When you start to realize that your flesh is just getting too much control and too much traction, you just set something down. And I'm not going to do it. I remember I fasted breakfast all summer one year, and like I've never felt more spiritual in my whole life. When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. How you doing? Oh, not real good. I'm fasting for Jesus. Hey, you going to the dance? Oh, no. I have to be at home not being at a dance. This is Jesus. He's going, hey, if you're doing something, like, stop trying to get attention for it. This is Jesus. This is Jesus saying, stop trying to get attention. Quit being such a diva. Stop putting everything on Instagram, for goodness sakes. If you want to know how Jesus feels about your Instagram. I'm kidding. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head. This is how they would clean their hair. Wash your face so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Now, here's a question with no answer. God says, do this. It's in this that you'll live in blessing. I'm asking you to live in the artery of blessing. This is what Jesus is inviting us to, that you live in the flow or in the current of the blessings he's got for you. And that has turned into a prosperity gospel. And a prosperity gospel says, give, and it'll be given back to you, pressed down, shaken together, running out. Like, we've all heard the verse. But the prosperity gospel goes 3 steps further. And I heard it this week. I listened to a video this week. And he said, if you believe that you want God to pay off your credit card debt, listen to me. This is true. You can Google it yourself if you want to. That if you will sow a seed, listen, sowing a seed is a biblical concept. But for some reason, anytime you hear sow a seed in church, you're like, uh-oh. It's about to get weird. If you will sow a seed of $1,000 on that credit card to this ministry, so you can't be to anybody else's ministry. You gotta be, you sow a seed of $1,000, brother, into this ministry on that, God will eliminate your credit card debt. Literally, I told Lacey, I paused it, and I looked at Lacey, and I'm like, they would lynch me. I love that you guys aren't stupid. If I tried that, you'd be like, we're going to have an election, and I don't know who's getting voted in, but we know you're getting voted out. We don't even have votes, sorry. But this concept, now here's the question with no answers, is God says, like, if you do it, just hush about it. It's a relationship between you and I, and that he has a desire to bless you, and I believe that. But then it turns into, we hate the prosperity gospel because we see how, like, oh, a $60 million jet. Why not? So we hate the predatory picking on the people that are the most likely to send you money. Like, we don't like that. But at the same time, God says, if you're doing something, stop doing it so that everybody can see it. And as people, listen, it's not as easy to get out of this as you think. If we're not careful, what we find is that we are subconsciously always performing our religion so that it can be seen, so that we can garner. Happens all the time. We want to be thought of it. And as much as we hate this about ourselves, the reason we don't talk about it is we don't like to admit that it's there. And then we feel challenged that God goes, why? Like, I feel like in this church, we've got this field that we've just kind of let go a little bit. Like, think of it in farming terms. We've just sort of let this field go for a little while. We focused on other things. But now it's time that we begin to reclaim back the generosity concept of following Jesus. Like, we need to begin to reclaim the concept of generosity, but even that provides pitfalls, because if you're not careful and you're like, you know what, you're right, I'm going to give. God has blessed me. It's so easy to see what you want. Sometimes it's hard to see what you have. I'm going to say that again. That in this church, you guys are so rich. No one likes being called rich. It's an insult. You know who gets the most insulted by being called rich? Rich people. Now, you may not be rich compared to the guy next to you, but you are super rich compared to the rest of the nation. And our nation is super rich compared to the rest of our planet. See what I mean? Like, it's so easy to get stuck in this prosperity gospel of like, well, I want more. And so the temptation would be, as a pastor, I'm like, you want more? I can play on that. There's a method for that. You begin to sow into the ministry, and God's going to give you, like, stop. If God has challenged you to become more generous, just do it. I don't want to hear about how offended you are that the church talks about money. I don't care. It's between you and God. It's between you and God. And do not write a check and then come tell me about it because there's something you want to see changed around here. Not that that ever happens. How much time do I have? We're not going to finish. If you want to watch me just mechanically shut down, stop listening, start with, I give a lot to this church, but... Do you guys know I don't even know who gives? I don't even look at the records. I have no idea who gives what. No clue. So if I've ever been rude to you and you're a big giver, that's just... Sorry. Here's a question. Is it possible, then, to be selfless in following Christ? Is it possible? And I think if you're like me, then you begin to ask that question. You're like, yeah, you could. No, because even giving to the poor makes you feel superior. So Paul is saying, right? Like, even when you do things that you're supposed to do, you feel better. And you're like, okay, then I won't do them. Well, that's just disobedience. And you're like, but I don't. How can I selflessly follow Christ? When you stop and think about it, all of a sudden you're like, everything that you could conceive of right now, almost with the exception of one. Let me tell you a story. June 11th, 1963, the leader of Vietnam, this was when people didn't even know Vietnam was a place. Vietnam was just a blip on the map. Most Americans couldn't have found it, didn't know what it was, might have thought it was a city. The leader, his name was No Dinh Diem, was the leader of Vietnam, and he was a Catholic. He was a devout Catholic. His brother was the archbishop, and the country was 90% Buddhist. And the 90% Buddhist felt like No Dinh Diem was taking advantage of his position of power. He was giving preferential treatment to the Catholic Church. When his brother had a celebration being the archbishop, he encouraged people to wave the Vatican flags in Vietnam. But then when the Buddhists had their celebrations, he outlawed any religious flags at all. So see, it's religious oppression. And they were experiencing religious oppression to the point that they began to feel like that they just wanted equal. According to what's been written down, if there's more, it's not been written that I can find. But they just wanted equal opportunity to the Catholic freedom. They wanted as much freedom as the Catholics, and they were 90% of the country. No Dinh Diem was not a fair guy. He was not even a good guy, and he said no. And so there was a protest. And at this protest for the Buddhist religion, 9 people were killed because they sent in armored vehicles. They sent in, it just got out of control. In fact, 2 of the children were children. They got killed because they were ran over by armored vehicles in Vietnam. Now, this is way before the Vietnam that you've heard. So things were completely out of control. Religious oppression was just running completely off. No Dinh Diem had said, no, we're not going to do it. He just came, he said, no, you're not going to get the same rights as my religion, because that's just kind of unfiltered humanity right there. Usually we at least have the decency to pretend that we're going to be fair. So on June 11, 1963, 350 people entered the city. And you've probably seen the picture, but on an intersection, there was a guy. He was a monk. He was an older monk. His name was Thich Quang Duc. And he sits down on a pad, sits cross-legged, and his friends begin to cover him in gasoline. Now listen, if you think we're about to get weird here, I promise, just bear with me. It's a weird story. It's an awful story, but just bear with me. Covers himself in gasoline. His friends pour gasoline on him. You've probably seen the picture. He sat cross-legged. He finished a prayer, a Buddhist prayer. He finishes his prayer, strikes a match, lights himself on fire, sitting in the intersection. And that said that everybody, it's chaos. There's just chaos everywhere. The reaction, as you can imagine, to a man sitting there burning in an intersection, and everybody's running around and there's chaos. And they said the only person who didn't move a muscle was this monk. He sat there cross-legged, never made a sound, never moved the entire time. I was listening to this story. It's in a book about other stuff that's not related to anything that we're doing here. And Man, you hear that story, and like you can even feel it in this room. You hear the story of somebody who believes something so much that they would go to such lengths, then you go, man, that lands somewhere, doesn't it? Like it lands somewhere different of like, ah. See, and this is not what we're seeing in war today, where someone sends in a suicide bomber to blow up the enemy. This is not a tactical war engagement. I watched a documentary about kids who had been intercepted before they became suicide bombers, and they had been told that the bomb only exploded outwards and that they would be saved, and then they were given drugs. And like what we're seeing with suicide bombing and then the promises of what's going to happen on the back, that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about someone who, wrong as he may have been, believed so much in the cause that he believed in that he was willing to sacrifice himself to be heard. And I wrestle with that. I wrestle with it. I wrestle with it because I don't like that story, and it lands weird, and it stings my humanity, you know? But how do you, it's a different thing. How do you combat that? Imagine that's your enemy. Imagine that your enemy, someone from the other side, comes and does that, and then you're asked to give a statement. See, there's no self-benefit to this guy at all. We are so used to religion being self-beneficial, right? Power grabs. I'm going to give a little bit. I'm going to invest suffering, but only so that I can get back. See, isn't that what the prosperity gospel is? It's still just gaining. It's still just earning. When you see a guy that willingly gives away whatever power he has in his life, it says that the wife, No Dindium's wife came out, or maybe it was a sister-in-law, one of the other, came out, and her statement, her official statement was that, well, he was just very intoxicated, and she goes as far as to say that the gasoline they used had been imported. Oh, okay, well. It kind of ties your hands, doesn't it? That this guy believed in it so much that he said, I just want our people to be heard. What do you say? It's different when someone just lays down their life. And here's the problem. It says that 350 people walked into Saigon that day. And after that, they collected his body. And when they walked out, 1,000 people left with him, including police officers who sat down their arms and walked out with them. It was a powerful, meaningful moment. It was the thing that eventually got the leadership overthrown. The U.S. allowed it. It's kind of what probably, honestly, triggered the Vietnam War indirectly. It was a moment that didn't go silent. So as I'm thinking through this, if you're freaked out, don't panic. Like, we're not going to some weird place. I know religion has a kind of rough history, but listen to how Colossians chapter 2, verse 20 opens. It says, since you died with Christ. See, we already read this once. We read this morning. We might have skipped over that. We get so used to hearing those words, don't we? That we died with Christ, that we laid down our life in Christ. We laid down our life in Christ. We're so used to hearing that then you hear a story like Thich Quan Duke and you go, whoa, wait a minute. Why would he do that? It's the elemental concept of Christianity. It is the most basic element of Christianity to say, my life is no longer of more value. My physical self, but that opens the door. It's like, wait. Wait a minute. What are we signing up for? It says, since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? See, that's the key. The selfless follower of Christ, it's going to be a struggle. It will always be an element of that. But it's the concept. Listen, if you want to know what we're doing here, this is what we've been asked to do, is to lay down the old life and lay down with it the rights that we felt like we were owed in it. That's where the prosperity gospel, to me, I struggle because it feels so similar to my old sin nature. It's like a Jesus religion based on benefiting my old self. The self that I said I was laying down when I accepted Jesus. See, it gets weird when we don't accept laying down the old life, but this is what if we're trying to get a concept of Jesus, if we're trying to understand Jesus, here it is, is that we are asked to lay down our life, but because of Jesus, we are given life back. We say this so often, it's like it's old news. We talk about this so much, we're like, oh, yeah, got it. Listen to what I'm saying. It's that we were given a death sentence. And I don't care how offensive, generally people are so offended when you tell people that they were bad enough that they deserved hell. Because they look around and they go, well, I'm better than most people. Isn't that funny? Or like, you're rich. Well, I'm not super rich. I'm just richer than most of the world. But I'm not rich. And you go, well, you're bad. Well, I'm better than most of the world. See the measuring, how hypocritical we are? See, sin was measured against God. Has nothing to do with you. Sin has nothing to do with you. Take yourself out of it. Sin is measured against God, and it does not hold up, right? And so because we were in sin, we were given a death sentence, and our religion is not how we deal with our death sentence. Please hear me. Our religion is not us trying to alleviate or sidestep the death sentence. Jesus is saying this, accept it. Accept the death sentence in the old life, because the old life had bondage, and it had struggles, and it had manipulation, and it had unforgiveness, and it had greed, and it had sexual immorality, and it had all of these things that you were never going to beat. No matter how religious you were never going to beat your sin. So just accept the death sentence. I think we know this, but do you know what baptism is? Baptism is when we willingly accept the death. Like what Jesus has called us to demonstrate is this acceptance of a burial. This is not a sermon that attracts millions of people. We might have already lost some of you in here. I'm looking for something a little more trendy. It's a burial, but that's not it. That's not where it ends. That's why the story of Jesus is so miraculous, is the second half of that is you are reborn into Christ, into a new life. The American church has become so broken because we want the new life while we're holding on to the old one. We are not willing to selflessly pursue Christ. We're saying, Jesus, keep adding to what I've already collected. And when you see someone who is willing to go through the physical steps for what I believe to be the wrong religion, because I think I don't like any religion. But when you see someone who is so committed to what they believe that they will give up self, it triggers something in us. It's what we are called to in our depths and in our soul. There's something we connect to that goes, that seems more right than whatever religious practices I'm doing. I know it's gotten quiet, but I think you know I'm right. Like, I'm not advocating what happened in Saigon at all. I'm saying because of Jesus, that doesn't have to take place. Because Jesus went through the crucifixion for us. We're not having to light ourselves on fire in the streets. That's not at all what we're called to. We're called to recognize that spiritually we're laying down our lives. And because Jesus laid down his life, we are resurrected into a new life. And our mental health depends. Our spiritual mental health. It's a new thing that I just invented. Do you ever feel like spiritually you're just going crazy? I can't figure this out. I cannot figure out what's going on. The reality is, at the core of our spiritual craziness is a desire to cling to things from the old life and earn things from the new life. Jesus is saying you can't do both. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says it this way, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old is gone, the new is here. You can't reasonably argue if you accept that Jesus died. You can't reasonably be skeptical of the message of Jesus. I think people can't see Jesus because of their skepticism they've developed over the church. I think sometimes people struggle to see Jesus because they're skeptical because they've known Christians. I think people struggle to see Jesus because they've seen the message abused by people with self-interest. I mean, I get that there's a distraction, but the truth is, the message of Jesus is very hard to be skeptical about when he says, I'll lay down my own life first. And I didn't have to. I'll do that. I'll give up my rights. I'll give up everything that is me. I'll give it up. I'm handing it off. I'll be crucified on your behalf, and I'm asking that you be able to do the same thing, but then be born again. How could we be skeptical about that message? So here's a challenge. You got a challenge, and then we're done. Because we've covered a lot of ground, I know, and I don't want you to go home and be like, what was church about? Buddhist. Are we? We're not Buddhist. And if any of you light yourself on fire, I'm going to be so mad. The challenge is this, is identify areas in your life that you're still holding on to the old life. Let me read you a couple. I got a list. Just in there, yours might be different. But if you're dealing with unforgiveness, you haven't died yet. You can't offend a dead person. You haven't spiritually accepted the death that Jesus has offered. If you're struggling with unforgiveness, you're clinging to the old life. And anytime you're clinging to the old life, it's stretching you apart before you can get to the new life. It's a frustration. There's nothing worse. I used to hear it all the time. There's nothing worse than somebody who's mediocre. The sinners, at least they're having fun. There's nothing worse than being in the middle and trying to do both. If you're dealing with unforgiveness, you're trying to do both. Greed. You know that Jesus talked about greed a lot, and the church talks about greed almost not at all. If you're dealing with greed, I heard a line about a month ago. It says, God promised that he has enough for our need, but not enough for our greed. Think about the math of this. If everybody is self-interested, eventually you run out. If everybody is dealing in this altruistic, out-seeking love, there's plenty for everybody. This is not political. Please don't take it there. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you're dealing with greed, you have not accepted your death yet. We signed a loan of about, I think I was 26, 10 years ago, something like that. And on the paperwork, they said, sign here. And I go, what's this? And they said, that means if you die, your loan's paid off. Well, that didn't help me any. But there's a little element of truth in that, right? That like dead people can't owe anything. Your greed, it just doesn't make sense. Selfishness, obviously, selfishness doesn't work. Sexual immorality, manipulation. Hey, if you're still trying to manipulate God, you haven't accepted the first half of salvation yet. If you're still trying to manipulate God to get what you want, like, hey, look, Jesus, I paid my tithe out of that money that you gave me. Wait. What Jesus is saying is that there's only real freedom in the new life. That's it. That's what Paul's trying to teach us is there's no freedom in it. You do this, you try this, you act like this, you pretend this, you work like this, you fast over here, you give over there, and at the end of the day, there's no freedom in it. You can't give freely. You can't love freely. You can't live freely if you're trying to cling to the elements of the old life. And I think if we're not careful, we get so distracted with the Jesus loves you so much, he wants you to have a Bugatti. He might. If you have one, great. But that's not the message of salvation. The message of salvation is about death and resurrection. The message of the gospel of Jesus is about death and new life. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that's the takeaway. If somebody goes home and tries to remember what the sermon was about, that it's that you accepted death and resurrection so that we can accept death and resurrection. That God, anytime that we're offended, we're clinging to an old life. Lord, in reality, we should claim no rights. If we got it right, none of us do. Listen, I know none of us get it exactly right, but the concept is true, that God, we would claim no rights if we accept our death first. Everything is a blessing. Everything is a gift. Everything is something that's undeserved. All of a sudden, we can start to worship, not from a place of imposed worship, but genuine response, that we didn't have to experience death the way that we deserved it. We get to experience death, and on the back end of that, a resurrection. Thank you for the concept of salvation, that your Son, the gospel of Jesus, is that he took it for us. Pray in Jesus' name, amen.